Hey, everybody, and welcome to AWE Nite NYC Metaverse versus Shmetaverse. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you are all doing well and enjoying the early days of fall. Can you smell it already? AWE Nite is a monthly meetup organized by AR.org, a nonprofit with a mission to advance AR in order to advance humanity. And we do it by bringing together the best in XR with the best of the XR community, which is you guys. So thank you very much for joining. Today, we have a really special debate focused on a term that is taking the world by storm, and yet is completely misunderstood and debated. With me today are two great voices in the world of AR, VR, and the metaverse to dig deeper and make sense of it all. Give it up for Avi Bar-Zeev and Abby Hunter-Syed. Thank you for joining us, folks. My name is Inbar. I am the founder of AWE and Super Ventures, and I have one question for you. Are you ready to get augmented?
Yes.
Always works better in person, but let's get right into it. By joining AWE Nite, you actually join a global network of AR professionals that meet in over 24 cities around the world. Currently, most of them are taking place online. So if you want to join a city near you, check out this link. And since we're now part of this incredible community, let's get social. All right. Follow us on Twitter for the latest news in AR and VR. Definitely check out our YouTube channel with the largest collection of videos about AR and VR, including meetups like this one. And for a weekly digest of the latest in AR and VR every Friday in your inbox, sign up for our weekly special newsletter. And yes, AWE will be back in person this November in Santa Clara. After 2 years, the XR community is finally getting together for the great XR reunion. So check out the incredible agenda and the lineup of speakers, which is probably the best we've ever had, and a great list of exhibitors and sponsors. And since you guys are our greatest supporters, we have a special discount code for you. If you haven't signed up yet, use code AWE20D for 20% off the different ticket options that we have online. And AWE also offers online classes this year for XR professionals as part of the AWE Academy. And here are some of the upcoming workshops. If you're interested, go ahead and check them out on the site on this link below. And today we'll talk about the M world with Avi and Abby. Avi and Abby, by the way, is also a new TV kids show that will air soon. But before we get started, I want to warn you, this is not a primer about the metaverse. It is not another futile attempt to define the metaverse. Instead, we'll go deeper and try to tackle some of these fundamental questions. We'll talk about the M curse. Is it a single term that will rule it all? We'll look at the impact of the metaverse on the creator economy. We'll see what could happen with the truth and how will the metaverse reach everyone. We'll also talk about how to protect our privacy. And of course, we'll also talk about the opportunity and how to capture it. Finally, we're definitely here to answer your questions. So feel free to drop your comments and questions during the debate in the chat, and we'll try to address them as we go through the discussion. Sounds good? Like the questions? All right, and don't worry, by the way, we will not mention for the millionth time that this term was first described by Neil Stephenson in Snow Crash. There will be none of that. We'll also not mention the fact that just until a few months ago, the term was pretty niche and was only used by a few geeks out there. That is until March this year, where according to Google Trends, it exploded. And if you ask what happened in March, I definitely won't mention the $38 billion IPO by Roblox, which kind of kicked off a lot of this craze. Or maybe it was actually because of this and the epic battle between Epic and Apple. And I definitely won't mention this one. Or even this, the fact that the $69 million sale of an NFT, it got even the banks excited. People like Citibank started writing about it. And you definitely won't catch me mentioning the tech giants, which started rebranding with the M word. But actually, I want to do a quick exercise with you. Let's see if you can match the slogan with the company. Starting with the first, the Metaverse company. Who's that?
Facebook.
Facebook, that's a good one, easy. Let's try another one. Enterprise Metaverse. Who's the Enterprise Metaverse company? Anyone?
Microsoft.
Microsoft, thank you, Avi. How about the Metaverse Cloud?
Niantic.
Niantic, that's close, but not accurate. The cloud, folks. Who has all the hardware in the cloud to make the metaverse work?
NVIDIA.
NVIDIA.
Oh, NVIDIA.
Yeah, that's right.
NVIDIA.
And how about the real world metaverse? Well, I
That
guess
one's
that's
Niantic.
Niantic. And finally, who vowed to democratize the metaverse?
Unity.
Unity.
That's right. So the question is how would Apple rebrand with the M word? Would it be the metaverse different, or maybe the metaverse walled garden? Who knows? And I'm thinking also about AWE. Should we rebrand it as your friendly metaverse community? Let me know what you think about it in the chat. So the thing is that, in Korea, apparently they're already living in the metaverse. Professor Kim Song-kyun says that's because of the sadness and anger of the millennial and Z generations due to the polarization in our community. So I guess that's what we're expecting in the near future. And by the way, there's a lot of good reading about the metaverse, like Matthew Ball's series. There's the Chief Metaverse Officer, Kathy Hackle. Avi wrote a great series of blog posts. Abby and LDV published this report about the metaverse and the opportunities for creation tools. So really a lot of good stuff. And here, this is something from just this week at AWE Asia. The general manager of HTC, Alvin Graylin, put up these 6 laws of the metaverse. So what do you think about that? Is it really kind of helping create some boundaries and some rules for the metaverse? To me, it looks a little bit like a wishful thinking, but yeah, definitely makes sense. And just this week, AR Insider called the real world part of the metaverse, or in other words, the AR cloud, the Metaverse. And even Wired co-founder Kevin Kelly, who introduced the term mirror world for that, actually liked it. So I can't wait to hear what Avi has to say about it in a few minutes. But the whole thing reminds me of this old Indian story about a group of blind people who debated what's an elephant like. And as you can guess, each one of them described it in a completely different way, depending on what part of the animal they were holding. One described it as a powerful giant, another described it as a giant snake, a third described it as a large cow, the fourth as a piece of old rope. And the last one concluded, I don't even believe elephants exist at all. So I think that's kind of the debate we're currently seeing around the metaverse. But for me, it's really about finding a cool name to describe the next wave of spatial computing. And when you think about it, the one clear thing that separates this wave from the past waves is that it's spatial. And I think that's a great point to kick off the debate. So if you're still wondering why we named this meetup Metaverse versus Shmetaverse, let me give you a quick linguistic lesson before we get started. Where is it coming from? Well, you probably know it was borrowed from Yiddish, which is, kind of a fusion language that was invented by Eastern European Jews. And many of the words from that language actually made their way into the English language, like chutzpah and nosh, kvetch. It's a very onomatopoeic language that is ideal to convey emotions about things. Adding the sh as a prefix is generally used to indicate sarcasm or skepticism, like Joe Schmo, as in who cares about this thing. And this is really at the core of the debate today. Is this the greatest term ever that will help bring AR and VR to the masses? Or is it a fad, too broad, too abstract, too hard to define, that should really be dismissed as Shmetaverse? All right, that's kind of the foundation for our discussion today. Let's get to know Avi and Abby and then dive into the big debate. So Avi, let's start with you. Give us kind of 30 seconds about yourself, why you're here, what's your beef with the metaverse?
Sure. I've been working in XR, or whatever you want to call it, for about 30 years now. And one of my earliest experiences was in a startup where I was very, very junior. Neil Stevenson actually hung out at my startup in Seattle. I had not yet read Snow Crash, but we were trying to do things that were very much like what he wrote about. This was all back in 1992, and I was convinced that it was not going to happen. The internet would never take off unless it was 3D, unless we all had avatars and were flying around like in Second Life. That was the vision. I was so sure of it, and I was wrong. And the internet took off and did just fine without having things be in 3D. And I've spent a lot of the time since then thinking about, well, what is it really going to take? What is the thing that's really going to change our lives in the future? And a lot of the things people talk about, I think, are correct, but I have focused on AR for the last 12 years. First, at Microsoft, trying to help them revamp their programs a bit. And one of the successes that we had was launching HoloLens out of all that effort. Then at Amazon, where we worked on the Echo frames, which are, the very small, lightweight devices that may someday evolve into something more complicated, but today it's meant to be fashionable and useful. And then I spent about 3 years at Apple, which I can't talk about, but my goal was to help advance the state of the art as much as I could, and focus on important issues like privacy. So I have a pretty good amount of experience now on the hardware side. I have earlier experience on the software side and design side, and would very much look forward to talking about all of these different aspects.
Thank you, Avi. I'm incredibly happy to have you with us. And next we have Abby, a partner at LDV Capital. Abby, tell us about why you're here and your beef with the metaverse.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Ori said, I'm a partner at LDV Capital. We're the only venture capital firm that invests in people building businesses powered by visual technology. So I think of those as being anything that leverages computer vision, machine learning, or artificial intelligence in order to analyze visual data. Right? And so, well, Avi talks a bit in his blog post about all of the VCs and the money who's been hopping on board to the trends around the metaverse. It's actually, visual technologies are the core of what LDV does since its origination, right? We're built off of this premise that the vast majority of data that our brains analyze is visual. So for AI to succeed, it's got to be able to analyze visual data as well. And inherently, everything that we do on our screens is visual in nature. And so those worlds, the metaverse, the AR, VR, everything that we do via screen is just our portal into the next thing. And we consider that to be a visual technology. And so we published a report. We did a deep dive over the summer about, what's next, right? Where is everything going for the future of content creation and, the dreaded M word. And so that's why I think I'm here talking to you today about where we think it's going to be going.
Thank you, Abby. Awesome to have you here with us. All right, let's kick it off with Avi. Avi, you wrote about the M curse. And, we've seen the definition has grown to include both real and virtual worlds, and everyone kind of adds something to it that fits their picture, their own view. What did you mean with the M curse?
If we jump back a few years, there was this thing called the Metaverse Roadmap. And I contributed to it by giving them, 8 or so different definitions for various words like AR or immersion. And each of those definitions was really short. It was like a sentence or two. But when the group of 30 or so people who were trying to figure out how to define the metaverse, they couldn't get it down to less than 5 different definitions. And this was early on. And so it's incredibly hard to say what is the metaverse, because everybody has a slightly different idea. I mean, even if you just boiled it down to 3, it's either, the sort of snow crash like worlds, that a lot of people like, this idea of just being able to be another person and go out and move into a whole different, life. And I think Second Life really epitomized that idea. In the books, you didn't even want to say your real name because you might be killed in real life. So it was very important to have this alternate identity where you could be something different. And then there's another vision of it, which is what a lot of people are talking about today, which is, that it's much more of a giant universe where you have galaxies and planets linked together into vast, a vast 3D map. And we can move our loot and our avatars between these and even overlay this stuff onto the real world, which is where I start to have a concern about it. I don't worry so much about all the fictional stuff, but when we start overlaying this stuff onto the real world, I get really concerned about how that's going to happen. And then there's a whole other view, which is it doesn't even have to be spatial. Some people don't even require that of the metaverse. It's really just that it's the internet of the future, and it's decentralized, and that's probably more important to some people that it's decentralized than it is spatial. And here, the issue that I have with it is they very often forget to talk about some of the biggest downsides of the internet as it was made, which is privacy. And the internet was just not designed to really protect our privacy. We see ourselves being exploited all over the place. And so any discussion of the next internet has to start with the fundamental of what was wrong with the current one and how do we fix it before we start adding a whole bunch of stuff. And decentralization is one of those things. And I do like that idea of trying to hobble some of the centralized powers, with decentralization. Not that it solves everything. You can still have a large decentralized group all of a sudden be taken over by 51% of the votes, and now it becomes essentially centralized again, with people who don't have our best interests at heart. But the most important thing I think to fix is privacy. So I have a real beef with all the people who talk all these about all these great pie in the sky ideas, but they never mention the fundamentals of how this is going to play out and how are we going to do it differently this time to really make it better. So I'll probably get to it later, but I have a different vision for it, and you could call the vision that I described the metaverse as well. But my point is why do we keep saying it's not that metaverse, it's this other metaverse that I mean? at some point we have to be really clear about what we mean, and we have to start using actual words. Like I joke that it's kind of like the word Smurf in the Smurfs. It just starts to be a placeholder for everything. And so, Smurfy Smurf, Smurf the Smurf again, what are we going to do about it? I don't know what you mean. I don't know what to do about that because you're not being specific enough. So that's where I really start to have the concern. But I agree with everybody. Something big is coming. There's lots of great ideas. We're going somewhere, and we have to design it carefully. I just think we can be a little more crisp about our terminology and about our intentions, and not forget about these things that are really fundamental.
So for you, it includes the entire spectrum from the virtual world to the real world?
I'll accept that definition, but if we really want to get into it, I do think that AR is different in many ways. Not that if you wear an AR headset around 10 years from now, I think there'll be content that we will all agree is part of the metaverse. But where I have a problem is that if we're wearing our AR headset walking down the street, what we don't want to see is all of the content, right? Today, there's none, it's a desert. But in 10 years, it's going to be a jungle. And how do we filter that? How do we decide which part we want to see at the spot we're at? There could be 1,000 different experiences on that one street corner, and we don't want to see all 1,000 at once, right? That would be like trying to listen to 1,000 pieces of music at once. It would be incomprehensible. And so the thing that is going to help us filter that is the more important thing to talk about, which is the thing that I call the contextual discovery engine, or the spatial discovery engine. And the key idea is there's some personal technology that knows about me, and you have yours that knows about you. And that is what's going out and fetching content, and only the content that I really need to see right now, not all of it, not all at once, not mushed together, not spatially stitched, just what I need. And if it's finding lunch restaurants, great, let's focus on finding lunch restaurants. And as it does that work, let's make sure it's not leaking my private information, because it knows so much about me. It needs to be on my side, not on the side of some advertisers. And so therefore, it shouldn't be making blind requests to servers that it doesn't know about, because those leak information. And it shouldn't be allowing the equivalent of cookies, and it shouldn't be allowing all these invasive technologies, web bugs, et cetera. It needs to be really secure and really about me. That's a personal device. That's an AR kind of headset. And sure, it can connect to the metaverse, but it isn't the metaverse. The metaverse is the data. That the metaverse is the experiences that we go fetch. But AR is the interface. AR is the piece of technology that lets us connect to whatever we want to connect to. And that's a key difference that keeps getting glossed over.
Awesome. Great kickoff, Avi. Thank you. Next time, just add a bit more anger. I want to see more emotion in your delivery. All right. I'm kidding. All right, Abby, you wrote a report about the metaverse and some of the creative opportunities and visual tools needed for creating the metaverse. Did you find the term useful as a way to unify all these aspects related to AR, VR, digital content of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that the middle ground, right? Because we don't want to take us. I think that the metaverse is still under construction, right? Like what it is, what it means, why there's so many different definitions of it is because it's still under construction, right? And maybe where I differ a little bit from Avi in this is that I don't necessarily think that there's like a central planning power who's going to make this version of, the metaverse or the internet or whatever you want to call it, so much better than what currently exists today. I think that the way that it's going to develop is naturally and organically, and people are going to vote by where they interact, right? And so when we define metaverse, the central ground that we found with it is just an interactive virtual space. Many of these are 3D in nature, right, or immersive. But there's many different ways you can immerse yourself in that environment. It could be via headsets, right? And otherwise, it could be via our screens, which is how most people do it today, or via a gaming console, right? And so that's kind of where we took the stance on it. And I think that something that's really interesting about content creation and how it inevitably feeds and leads to the metaverse, right? Or these interactive digital spaces are the fact that like the content itself can actually be monetized, right? As Avi's talking about decentralized tools and automation tools, right? What this is ultimately leading to is can instead of our privacy and our data being sold for ad dollars, could we instead be selling the content that we create, directly to others as, NFTs have hit the mainstream and things like this. And that's where we really saw the foray and like what's happening right now in content creation and the automation tools and the monetization tools and the direction that we're moving is inevitably going to lead us to places that are more interactive virtual spaces where people choose to exist, choose to purchase, and choose to do so much more.
And in your research, when you talk to people, did you find this term being used kind of as a singular term, just one metaverse for all, or do you kind of see it as more of a plural thing?
We saw it as everything, right? Like, if I asked everybody on this call, is it a metaverse or are there metaverses? I'm sure that we'd get, 51 different answers, right? Like, and so again, not to be Switzerland on this one, but I think it's still TBD, right? Like, and so for that sake alone, we say metaverses or metaverse, as a matter of fact. And we sparked controversy just by saying that as well.
All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about creation and ownership. So Abby, you wrote in the report that there will be 100 times more visual content online by 2027. Can you talk about some of the evidence or the things that point to that prediction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the biggest things that we're seeing today is just around automated tools, right? Like we know that there's three things that are most important for content, right? It's got to be high quality, it's got to be contextually relevant, and there has to be a large quantity of it now in order to bring you to the top of the algorithms, right? And so content creators are being pressured more than ever to hit all of these three things in like a really succinct fashion to maintain their followers and their communities and everything. And so the tools like GANs, for example, the way that we're seeing things like GPT-3 or NVIDIA's GAN or others being leveraged along with, synthetic media as a whole, I think is driving us more towards this idea that AI is going to play a major part in the generation of content. It's going to help us create more relevant content for our audiences. And it's going to really enable creators to focus on the creative. And the result is going to be just huge swaths of more visual content that we are, experiencing via our screens.
So let's dig into that for a second. And Avi, feel free to interject. I mean, today, sharing content online, like a selfie or a video or a story, it's pretty much the easiest thing to do. And we'll probably see even more than we want. And by the way, when we look at creating 3D content today, it's still a rare skill, right? So when it kind of becomes more spatial in nature in that metaverse, will it really be easier to create content?
It should be. I mean, this is what got me into AR and VR in the first place. Back in 1992, is I wanted to make movies, and I wanted to be able to make movies with just maybe me and one other person, not have to have 100 people in a Pixar full of people. And that's been my goal all along. Everything I've worked on sort of vectors towards that, but it's so far taken 30 years to get even close to that. And AI has been a big limiter because, even if you give people very good tools, the more complicated and powerful the tool is, the longer it takes to learn. So you lose on the ease of use side. And you may gain on the power and expressivity, but then you also lose on time because now it takes forever to go and paint all the little details you want of your Sistine Chapel. So AI really does help solve that by helping to fill in a lot of the work and the details that we don't want to have to do ourselves. The other thing that helps that tremendously is the reusability of content. One of the things the internet was built on was right-click view source, right? Somebody goes and puts up a website, you can just look at it and add to it and put out your own without so much concern so far about who created what, but I think that can be fixed. I think we can have a chain of ownership that lets people get valued for the value they add. They can actually be compensated or credited. But we have to solve that, and we have to solve the abundance of content, which also brings out a whole search engine issue of how do we find the content if we do want to reuse it? How do we find the good stuff out there? And those are hard problems. AI can definitely help with some of those problems. But the everybody's passion here is like on seeing, the holodeck, in Star Trek. It's like I should be able to just talk to the computer and say make a table and make it bigger and make it stone, and it should know what I mean, and it should be able to do what I expect with that level of ease, so that I don't have to be a sculptor or a programmer in order to make these things.
Yeah, and on that note, Abby, you wrote on the report that the role or the definition of the digital artist will evolve. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think let me give an example, right? Like if we think about movies, right, and VFX and where it stands today, there's always at the Hollywood tier for your Marvel movies, there is always going to be specialists who are looking at and defining every single detail of it, right? But by leveraging new tools that are out there that are like AI powered animation suites and auto rotoscoping tools and a bunch of the stuff that NVIDIA is doing in terms of the way in which you can control lighting in scenes and things like this. I don't think that we are far away from having a single individual produce a film or a movie that can be almost to the same caliber as a major movie production house, right? And I think that that's because the AI is getting so good out there that what you're really going to have to concentrate on is on your creativity, right? So your quality of content and that contextual relevance, because the technical skill, right, is really starting to be taken out of the equation, and it's only going to have to be tinkered at like the upper echelons of content, right? The most professional caliber. The vast majority that we see on a daily basis that's coming out of Hulu and Netflix and Amazon, right? They're not going to have to be that caliber, and so it's going to be much simpler and much better to use automated tools to produce it in a more time and budget-friendly fashion than it currently exists today.
We have Doug Thompson adding on the chat that one of the biggest sources of content for the metaverse would actually come from the real world through scanning, which is a really good point. All right. On the same topic of kind of creativity and creation and the fact that we'll see more and more visual content, perhaps more than language-based content, do you see kind of a change in the way people communicate? I mean, we know that, from a lot of research that the brain processes visual content much faster than the written content. Do you see a point where we have more visual items, kind of like the spatial emojis or the equivalent of that will replace a lot of the written language?
I think that one of the biggest things will be that video is going to replace a lot of that text. Right? Already, like we've got a portfolio company, Synthesia, that's programmable video. You can literally pop onto their site, type in the script that you want it to say, and the video will automatically produce it with, what's considered to be deep fake video, but it's synthetic media, right? And I think that, we're going to start to see all of those newsletters that come through our inboxes right now, all of the newspapers, right? Like if we're talking about, other content producers who are at the lower scale of production side of things and really cost conscious, I think it's all going to start to come via video. But that video is not going to feature a real anchor or a real actor. It's going to be an avatar.
Avi, do you think we'll use less written language and more visuals? Kind of, like on the road, when you think about traffic signs, a lot of them are visual because it's just faster to understand them, sort of kind of reading the whole thing, right? So do you see that kind of changing the way we communicate?
Yeah, I mean, I think eventually we get to even to a post-symbolic kind of communication, and it's a much bigger topic than we have time for, but the easiest way to think about it is, the beauty of text is you can pack megabytes worth of content in a word, right? If I just say tree and you imagine that tree, just imagine how much data I would have had to send over visually to equate the tree. And not only that, but you picked the tree that was personal to you. And so it's actually more meaningful than if I just picked a random tree and sent it to you. So the compression ratio on that word tree, the 4-letter word, is just immense. And when we start going to a visual medium, we start to balloon and need all this bandwidth to be able to say exactly what we need. And I think the future is one in which we'll be able to send the equivalent of a symbolic tree. It doesn't have to be the word tree, but it'll be the idea of a tree will be able to be sent from me to you. And it needs to be done in such a way that you actually understand what I meant. So if I was thinking of an oak tree, that comes across to you correctly. So, this is the fundamental of communication. Communication is about bridging the gap between two or more minds, getting them to agree on the same, not agree on the same, in the sense of we have the same opinions, but to agree on the content, to agree that when we say tree, we mean the same tree and not two other trees. And the quality of the communication is the degree to which we can agree that we both mean the same thing when we say the same thing. So we'll get to this post-symbolic communication at some point where it'll really be a bunch of concepts that are sent that are translated by computer, by AI, back into the versions that we understand, along with the context that the person who's speaking or writing or thinking will say. And that's a necessary step before we get into what will be the equivalent of telepathy, or when we start to have more advanced interfaces that go beyond the audiovisual ones. We're going to need to be able to translate concepts from one brain to another, because otherwise, what is telepathy even going to do? It's going to send alien data between us that are sort of incompatible thoughts. Well,
so you think we'll be able to get rid of the dreadful keyboard and just communicate?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, partly because it's just not as convenient in AR and VR anymore. It's very, making a keyboard is actually one of the harder things to do when you're in a mobile situation. The phone solved it relatively well with capacitive touch, but just typing in air is not a great situation. So I think we're going to figure out shortcuts, and we already start to see this a bit where today if you use messages and you type congratulations, it puts out fireworks automatically, right? We're going to start to see these things that are starting to enhance how we communicate with automation and AI that will jump in and try to help us convey what we mean through shorthand. Emojis are another example of that, where we're conveying much more complicated meaning through smaller, simpler symbols. But I think we're going to evolve a whole new language based on the mediums that become popular in the near term.
Just to add to that, right, we had Thomas Reardon, the CEO of Control Labs, at our Vision Summit a couple of years ago, talking about their brain-computer interface, the bracelet, before they sold to Facebook. Right? And so thinking about what Avi said in terms of how challenging it can be to type, a BCI bracelet that was built to help veterans without hands actually type on the computer starts to come together in how Facebook's been positioning themselves.
We're switching gears to talk about the post-truth era. An era where we don't know if what we see is real or fake, if it's real objects or virtual objects. Synthetic data will take kind of a big role in our future, deep fakes, and everything that comes with it. So Abby, what's kind of from your research again in the report, how do you see that kind of future evolving, and how can we tell the difference?
I think that we're just going to come to terms with the fact that the vast majority of people that we interact with on a daily basis aren't going to be human, right? Online, if we're talking about the world of the metaverse, right? But in order to combat some of the biggest challenges of that, that we'll be deploying lots of artificial intelligence solutions as well. And we've got a company called Clarify, where what they do is they look at visual data, and they use multimodal moderation in order to help moderate the vast swaths of content that are being produced. Because as quantity goes up, right, the human capacity doesn't necessarily match that. And so it's absolutely critical for us to think about ways in which we can develop systems to, help us not necessarily police, right, but at least moderate and authenticate the content that's being produced so that we understand the origination of it.
So Avi, what do you see as the future of it? Is truth dead?
No, privacy is not dead and truth is not dead, but it's gravely wounded. And I think we're going to need to do a lot of work to get back to a place where we can actually trust what we see and hear. I think that's actually the place for AR. I think this is, we can imagine there being, in AI even more so, but our personal devices of the future, if we trust where they come from, if we trust the companies that sell them to us, or they're built in such a way that they're open enough that anybody can inspect them to make sure that they're trustworthy, I think that we wind up with this personal filter, this thing that can help us to understand what is coming at us and whether it's attacking us or helping us. And I think it's a tool that I think a lot of people are going to need. It's something which can help, in the Google sense, it can help fact check instantly the facts that you're getting. It may be something which can aid you in detecting emotional cues that may tell us if somebody is being truthful or not, if they're human, and if they're AI, we may have other tools which may be able to help us there. But fundamentally, AR is about improving the real world, and it's about improving our connections with each other. And so I would reject any use of that technology, which goes in the opposite direction. And of course, we can all imagine Black Mirror cases where it does. There was one of the great episodes where, people are killing other people because they think they're aliens. And just by changing what the truth seems like, you can cause really dramatic effects and results. So we have to be even more vigilant. And I think we're going to have to work extra hard to build these personal defense barriers to things that are trying to attack and manipulate us. And then not the least of which, unfortunately, is advertising. Advertising is in many ways innocuous and not a big deal if it provides us with information, things we didn't know. But increasingly, advertising is fact-free, but highly emotionally loaded, and just designed to make us feel something and to feel like we need something without even understanding why we might even want it, based on more of an emotional manipulation. And that we've seen in elections, we've seen in product cycles, we've seen it all over the place. And it's something we're going to have to address. That we're all susceptible to manipulation, no matter how smart we are susceptible to emotional manipulation. And we're going to need tools to detect it and to counteract it as well.
Awesome. It's kind of like the Jules Verne book To the Moon, where there's this arm race between those who create the biggest projectiles and those who are creating the best shields to protect from that, right? So you have that kind of arm race that continues. The more people can create better deepfakes, the more people will create tools to detect those. Absolutely. All right. I see a really interesting comment from Rebecca. Actually, it relates to the previous question, but it leads us to the next question. And it's really about kind of the whole idea of training AI. It all depends on the data that you feed it. And today we see a lot of AI, a lot of the AI out there is flawed because it's fed with very specific information. It's not diverse enough. So the next question is really, how do you reach everyone with the metaverse? The need for diversity is obviously huge because, if it's not going to be diverse, it's not going to be relevant to everyone out there. So how do we make it more accessible, more reachable for everyone out there?
I think I want to start with this notion that the deep fakes are bad, or that synthetic media is bad, right? Because I don't necessarily think that's the case. I don't think it necessarily needs to be watched and be worried about as much as it is. I think that it's, we're already used to looking at Kim Kardashian on the cover of a magazine who's been photoshopped to no end, right? We're used to seeing people who are not real online in the same way that they are in person. And that's not necessarily bad, right? Because we all just know that that's there and it exists. And I think that that's how synthetic media and deep fakes are eventually going to be. And instead, the opportunity associated with that is this more diverse world, right, online than we necessarily get in person, right? Because we get to escape our physical forms and become the forms that we want to in these worlds, right? Like, we can choose to look like ourselves if we want to. We can choose to shuck all ideas of gender in who we embody. And we can present ourselves as that. And it's actually a truer version of who we are than if it was just my camera turned on right now, right? And so I don't think, or I don't have the worry as much about deep fakes and moderating them and watching them as closely as I think the hype in the news has always been around them.
Thank you, Abby. So Avi, how do we ensure participation of everyone in this new thing?
Yeah, I think the most important thing up front is I think we need to make sure that the people that are designing the new world, and it may be a lot of people, not a centralized effort. We need to make sure that the people that are designing this new world are also have diverse backgrounds, and it has tended to be relatively affluent white men who have done the work, unfortunately, and we get a certain result. And I think we need to make sure that it isn't just a bunch of affluent white men who are being considerate, but we actually include people who are diverse and bring different backgrounds. And a good example of that is, I've had the benefit of reading opinions of a lot of people who are transgender and understanding, to Abby's point, what is the value of virtual worlds in terms of being able to express oneself, the true inner self, as opposed to what form we may take currently. in our physical form. Being able to be something that we want to be, that we feel we are internally, is empowering to a very strong degree, and it's very important to protect those rights. But I think that I do have some of the concerns that other people are going to exploit that and also suffer from it. And so I don't have a giant concern about people being cartoon characters online. You can tell that's not a real person. But when you see, a salesperson who's made themselves just 10% taller because they know the studies show that being taller will increase their rate of closing deals, or somebody's just made themselves 10% better looking, but otherwise they look the same. I did an experiment with this. I used a computer-generated version of me that kind of roughly looked like me, but it was probably better looking. And I had people who know me, and they said they forgot what I'd look like. They started thinking that was me. And when I switched back to myself, they're like, well, that's a shock. It's not what I expected of you. And I think we see that with some of these, studies of what's happening with teenage girls and expectations about of body form and what they should look like. And I think if we had a virtual world, just as a thought experiment, if we had a virtual world in which everybody could crank up their attractiveness, I think a lot of people would, not everybody, but a lot of people would, just because everybody else is. And now by comparison, they feel like they need to do it more and more and more. And I think it can get us into a very unhealthy place if we're doing it for the wrong reasons. If we're doing it because we want to express who we truly are inside, I think I put that in the category of healthy in general. And I don't know, that's enough on that. But the diversity of the designers of the world and stakeholders, I think, has to be the first thing that we challenge. The people who are coming to standards groups and meetups and talking about this, we need to be much more inclusive than we have been. And that probably means one of the most important things to do is to first, tackle the problem of griefing and the problem of harassment, because that's the first thing that drives people out of these discussions, is that they'll get here and there'll be someone as loud as me will come in, hope and less well-intentioned, and come in and drive people away because they're not willing to listen to other people. They're not willing to accept people into the conversation. So let's solve that. Let's be welcoming, and then let's listen really carefully.
Fantastic. All right, folks, this week we just heard Facebook announced that they'll invest $50 million to build the metaverse responsibly. And, it makes sense because, it's probably the biggest threat that Facebook as well as other social platforms are facing. It's privacy. So is it enough, $50 million compared to what, like 87 billion or something revenue? Can it work? What do you think they should do? Let's start with Avi.
Yeah, I just posted another article about this. And if you do the math, let's assume conservatively that they're only spending $5 billion a year on this stuff. And if you do the math, I did a couple months ago, it's probably 6 to 10 billion. It's probably much higher than I was even estimating. But I based it on the percentage of the company that's working on XR technologies as a fraction of their overall expenditures, right? As if it were prorated. But the R&D costs are probably much higher in this space as well. So 50 million compared to 5 billion a year is a drop in the bucket. It's less than 1%, arguably. And if the 50 million is going towards being responsible, and the 5 billion is going towards this ad-driven, privacy-invading, sell your customers to, basically turn your customers into poker chips for advertisers to make bets on, there's just no comparison. It's not even a fair fight. So what I'd love them to say is, we're going to put half our money into whatever we're spending into internally and externally figuring out how to do this right, and start that conversation now, not just fund studies that will come back in 3 years with some data, but start having that conversation now about how to do this. One of the things that I would challenge all these companies to do, and I don't just limit this to Facebook, is if they're saying that they want to build an open and collaborative metaverse, the biggest challenge we can see is what's happened in the past with other technologies is the equivalent of submarine patents. And that is, we go and build these standards, and all of a sudden the companies come out of the woodwork and say, well, we own that. And they start charging royalties on these things. And so first step is pledge your patents, put them in a pool that's for the commons, that's for the common good, to say, we're not going to sue anybody. We're going to put these out there. They're purely defensive, so we can't be sued, but we're not going to sue anybody. We're not going to ask for any royalties off of this technology, so we can truly build an open standard. If you saw, I'm pretty sure this is true, that Microsoft made more money off of each Android phone sold than they did off of the OS for Windows phones.
Yeah.
So we don't want to be in that world where everything we want to do in this space is expensive because somebody's got to be paid off for having cornered whatever technology markets they can today. And we see that race already happening. Big sums of money being spent for patents right now.
So it's first of all, it's money, and then we were talking about a little bit about the privacy thing and the openness. So I think it's that going back to that inclusion, being able to bring the right people to the table to have these discussions in the first place, and spending that on the open part of this, spending that on the part that is going to benefit everybody, and not the proprietary part where everybody's trying to place bets on how are they going to make money in the future, right? So it kind of comes down to the business model in many ways, right? I mean, can a company like Facebook change the business model to be not so much in adverse to privacy? And maybe that's a good segue to Abby. You kind of looked at some of the new monetization techniques and ownership. How could that help change a little bit of the dynamics and maybe promote a bit more privacy than is today?
I think that all the stuff that we're seeing on decentralization, right, is absolutely a critical component to being able to enable creators to monetize their own creations, right? I saw a line the other day, I'm not going to steal it as mine, but that it was saying something, along the lines of our minds are too valuable to just do things for free, right? So basically what they were talking about is like, we should pay for the things that we want to experience, right? Like, because our minds are just being absolutely co-opted by all of the ads on all of the platforms that we scroll and the news that we read and everything else. And so it's well worth it to pay a subscription fee, or to tip the creator themselves, or to purchase access to reading that version of a book on Mirror, or whatever else it is that you want to do. And so I think that this is something that people, if privacy is important to us, or the people who privacy is important to, right? I think that they are willing to pay. I think that the tides are turning on that. And there's a bunch of different strategies out there and new monetization mechanisms that are really making it possible for us to pay instead of giving our minds away for free.
If you take, Facebook's $87 billion profit and divide it by the number of users that they have, it's not a ridiculous amount of money to imagine we pay $28 a year for free Facebook. I mean, is that crazy? Like, some people won't. And I don't like the idea that we'll have a tier of people who can afford it and the people who can't, who are stuck with ads. But it's not a crazy amount of money to think that yeah, for $30 a year, I pay more than that for watching stupid movies. So yeah, I'd pay that if it was a way to avoid the advertising, and that would probably save a bunch of money too, because a whole part of the company wouldn't be necessary.
And people do, right? Like, if you look at Hulu, if you look at Netflix, if you look at any of these ones that are like going up a tier and you can skip all the ads, like the number of people who do it are well over the majority now, from some of the recent data that I've seen. And so I think that there is just a culture around this that we've absorbed, like everything should be free online, right? And that's not necessarily the case. And I think that people are starting to weigh the opportunity cost of experiencing it for free.
Actually, YouTube is an exception. YouTube has the option to pay in order not to see any advertising. How many of you have actually paid YouTube to see videos? Really? Anyone else?
Well, if you look at Gen Zers, it's a growing portion, because they watch most of their television on YouTube anyways. But yeah, I mean, like Avi, what about your kids? Do they watch YouTube all day?
I have them blocked from YouTube. So I would, if the algorithms were better, there's good content on there for sure. But if YouTube did not lead everybody into these crazy conspiracy theories and do all the crap that we criticize them for, I would pay for it for sure. I'm just not willing to do it right now. My son can get, my younger son would use it all the time, and he's allowed to look at specific videos, but he's not allowed to spend any time on the site because the algorithm is so bad. And I think that, Ori, that underlines, I think, the main point is that any company whose business model is advertising, if they're really good at it, fundamentally is undermining the interests of their customers, of their end users. Their customers are the advertisers. And you know, there's the old saying of you are the product. But I think the most important thing to understand about that is if you're the user and somebody else is the customer, then the company is making their decisions in their interest and not in your interest for the most part. And the more money they need to make, and especially if they're public, they need to show profits every year, 20% growth, 20% growth. Where does that money come from? It either comes from more users or from making more money per user. And there's only so many people on Earth, right? Facebook's already at 3 billion. Eventually they max out on people. Maybe they'll start making people too, but eventually they're gonna have to crank up how much money they make off of each person, more than they do now. The only way to do that is to increase the amount of exploitation effectively. And so even if they're well-intentioned, and I like to not criticize the individual people in Facebook, but criticize the business model is corrupting. And we do need to move really quickly to other business models in which the expectation is, if it has value, you should pay for it. And including our brain and including our time. Those things have value. Those things are worth money.
Here, here. So while we're on the opportunity, which sectors do you think stand to benefit the most out of this new wave, the metaverse? Is it the hardware folks, the cloud tools, the apps, we as just users?
I personally think that the tools and anybody who's creating the tools, the businesses who are really focused on helping us create, so that we can create the lives that we want to, we can create the content that we want to, we can consume the content that we want to, we can pay for the content we want to, or make money off of the content that we want to. These tools are going to be the crux of the biggest opportunities over the next 5 years.
So you're thinking more the Photoshops of the world than, I mean, if you look at Roblox, which you could say is an app in this new world, is probably valued more than Unreal, which is kind of a tool for creating it. So Avi, what do you think?
I agree, but I don't think it's always going to be the case. I think that during gold rushes, the people who make money are the people selling the land and the pans, right? So the people mining the gold.
And the accountants.
The accountants, so if you had them, I mean, I don't think there were that many in the California gold rush, but a few. The people who, just call them the people who counted the gold, those are the equivalent of the accountants of the day. But that's right now. I think as there's this rush to flesh out the space, I think the tools are really valuable. I think the problem is traditionally the only exit for tool makers, creative tool makers, was get sold to Adobe or Autodesk, right? That was your business model. Surviving and thriving was just not in the cards for most of them. And now there's more purchasers. Now you can get bought by Epic or other, Unity, and there's other companies that are buying them. But I think we need to get to the place where the individual designers, people who are building content, can also make money off what they're doing, and do so in a way that isn't about scarcity, right? Right now it's about scarcity. NFTs are all about artificial scarcity, which goes back to the tulip craze of the 1637s or whatever it was, that these things bloom and then they die, almost literally, tulips. And we have to be very careful to not build a world based on that scarcity. What we really want to do is build it on abundance, so that everybody becomes a creator and everybody becomes a consumer of what everybody else is creating. But that still leaves open one problem, which is discovery. That everybody may be creating stuff and everybody may be consuming stuff, but if you've got to wander the virtual earth for years and years and years to find the good stuff, then we wind up with an economy of seekers and influencers and people who are paying to find stuff for us. And that also creates a weird skew. And Roblox is maybe the best example of that. It was a great video that people should watch recently. I don't have the link handy, but if someone has it, if knows what I'm talking about, please put it in the chat. It was about how kids are being exploited on Roblox. Kids are given these visions of making lots of money. They're probably even too young to be thinking about making lots of money right now, but they're creating things. But only the top 1/10 of 1% of the people are actually making money on Roblox. Roblox is keeping the vast majority of the money right now. So they're doing very well, but the individual creators are only the top ones, are the most popular ones are doing it. And that could be fixed with a much better discovery mechanism where, we're all different. We all have different tastes. If we figure out ways to feed us the content that we're going to like, then it's much more egalitarian and there's a much bigger spread, I think, for everybody. But right now it's all about the blockbusters.
Well put. So folks, we're almost at the end of our time. So what's the verdict? Is it, should we use the metaverse as the best ever term to help us kind of get these technologies to the mainstream, or shall we dismiss it as a Shmetaverse? Avi, what do you think?
I think we got to be more careful about our terminology. It's great to be excited about what's coming, but remember cyberspace. We got excited about that term, and do we use it today? No. And in fact, if you named your company cyberspace, you'd probably be at a disadvantage today.
A security company.
You'd be a security company, and it would feel very old school. And even just remember, you know, the World Wide Web was the official name for it, but none of us call it that. We call it surfing the web. Why surfing? Because that was a whole other metaphor that got mixed up with the web, but doesn't make sense. But that's what we say, surfing the web. The whatever we call this, you know, and there will be a name for it, and it will be broad, but it'll come out of everybody using it. It'll come out of the winners that you know, the inventors get to name it and the financiers get to name it, but ultimately it's the people who name it because they call it whatever they want to call it. So every attempt I've ever seen of people to brand it and say this is it and I'm the one who coined it, forget it. You're going to be roadkill.
Abby, Metaverse or Shmetaverse?
Agreed. Totally agreed with Avi on this one. It's too early to tell what the name is going to be, but there is something big happening in terms of interactive virtual spaces where we hopefully will all become better versions of ourselves, or at least different extended versions of ourselves.
Nice. So would you recommend startups and just, you know, people who pitch to investors or to others to use Metaverse as part of their slogan? Say, you know, we're a Metaverse company that does this. Is it good or bad?
I'll just go quick, and you know, I think Abby will have a better perspective on this. But you know, I joke that that's actually the Metaverse, and so you know, if using the word gets you the funding, and you all agree, and nobody's deceiving anybody about your goals, just like you know, I heard somebody say recently that some high percentage of AI companies don't actually use AI, but they say they are. Like, if you're telling the truth that this is what you want to do and you align with the vision, go for it. Use the word as long as it helps in understanding. But remember, the word is going to probably get a little stale as well, and it already has some negativity to it.
Like the graph that you showed at the beginning, right? Like there's all of a sudden been this spike in searches for the term metaverse, but if you actually compare that to, you know, a search for AI, for example, or a search for something else that's now become like a commonplace knowledge, you know, it's still, you know, like kind of at the forefront of the thinking around this, right? Like when you actually do a search for it, there's not that much out there, right? Like we all point to the same things. Like there's a reason why snow crash is referenced at every one of these calls, right? But we live in a bubble where we're kind of talking to other people who talk about the same thing over and over and over again. If you go out into the real world and you ask, you know, Tom, Dick, and Harry who are walking down the street, what's the metaverse? They'll be like, who the fuck knows, right? And so I think that is something that people are still trying to figure out a term to label it, to showcase what they do. And that's really, really challenging to do in Metaverse is the way that they're doing at the moment. And so, you know, I think that will evolve and change as you go, but it's not a negative, it's not a positive, it's just part of the hype cycle.
I see a lot of startup pitches, almost like, you know, 5 every day. And when I see, you know, we will build the metaverse, it makes the hair on my neck stand. I mean, talk about what you do, talk about something specific. I'm not like a kid on the street that never heard the term and it kind of gets me excited. I'm already in it. So tell me something that is really interesting about how you're going to do it in a unique way and not just use the term because everybody's using it. So that's kind of my personal take. But with that said, I want to thank our amazing speakers today, Abby and Avi. Remember the new TV show for kids soon on Netflix or Hulu or who knows. Thank you, folks. See you next time. You were really awesome.